On July 6, 1960, a United States Air Force officer named Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer sat down and wrote a letter that should not exist. He'd been asked to evaluate a map, a 500-year-old map drawn on gazelle skin by a Turkish admiral who had been gone from this world for 4 centuries. His conclusion, written on official U.S. Air Force stationery, signed and stamped, was that the lower portion of that map depicted the coastline of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. Not the coastline you can see today, the coastline buried under a mile of ice. The coastline humanity did not know existed until a Swedish-British seismic expedition drilled through the ice sheet in 1949. Ohlmeyer's exact words, "The geographical details shown in the lower part of the map agree remarkably well with the seismic profile." Then he added something that has never been addressed. We have no idea how the data in this map could have been obtained in 1513. That is the starting point. Not a rumor, not a forum post, a signed document from the United States military expressing confusion about how a map drawn 5 centuries ago could show a landscape discovered beneath a mile of ice, in living memory. Now, let's look at what that map actually is. Istanbul, 1929. Researchers cataloging the Topkapi Palace Library find a fragment of parchment roughly 87 by 63 centimeters, drawn in colored ink, annotated in Ottoman Turkish, dated to 919 in the Islamic calendar, 1513 in ours. The author identified himself in the margin notes. Piri Reis, Admiral of the Ottoman Fleet, a man who spent his life collecting maps the way other admirals collected ships. What makes this document immediately uncomfortable is that Piri Reis listed his sources openly. He compiled the map from 8 charts by Ptolemy, an Arab map of India, 4 brand new Portuguese charts, and a map made by Christopher Columbus for the West Indies. He also referenced sources he called Jafariya, which scholars identify as a corrupted form of Geographia, the Arabic title for Ptolemy's Geography, the great compendium of ancient knowledge housed in Alexandria before that library stopped existing. Trace that chain. Piri Reis is copying from Portuguese charts. The Portuguese are copying from older sources found as they pushed south along the African coast. And somewhere deep in that lineage, apparently, sits a document that shows the bottom of the world before its ice. The South American coastline runs down the right side of the parchment, normal enough. Then it bends east and continues, forming a landmass at the bottom of the map that sits roughly where Antarctica sits today. The academic reading is that this is Patagonia, compressed and bent sideways because the mapmaker ran out of room on the parchment. As a museum caption, that explanation is sufficient. Against the seismic survey data, it starts leaking immediately. The coastline at the bottom of the Piri Reis map does not match coastal Patagonia. It matches, with an accuracy the U.S. Air Force rated as remarkable, the subglacial bedrock of Queen Maud Land, a coastline currently sitting under 1,500 meters of ice that no human being knew existed before 1949. That gap between 1513 and 1949 is where the entire argument lives. The Antarctic question tends to absorb all the attention. What gets missed is the more immediate impossibility in the Piri Reis map. In 1513, you could not accurately measure longitude at sea. This is a physical fact, not a matter of interpretation. Knowing your east-west position on a moving ship requires a precise clock, a chronometer, that stays accurate through waves, humidity, and temperature shifts. The marine chronometer was not invented until 1761. That is a gap of 248 years. Without it, the best European navigators of 1513 were estimating their longitude by dead reckoning, tracking speed, time, and compass bearing, and hoping the compounding errors stayed manageable. They did not. Ships were routinely placing coastlines hundreds of miles from their actual positions. Charts from this period show it. The errors are not subtle. Charles Hapgood and his students at Keene College spent 7 years analyzing the Piri Reis map's grid structure. What they found was that the longitudinal distance between the coast of Brazil and the coast of Africa on this map is nearly correct. More than that, the map appears to be built on an equidistant projection centered on Cairo, a construction that requires understanding spherical geometry at a level of mathematical precision that Western science did not formally recover until the 1800s. The skeptical counter is that Piri-Reis got lucky. Stitching together local Portuguese charts, the errors happened to cancel. That would be a satisfying answer, except random navigational errors do not cancel. They compound. The entire reason the longitude problem was treated as a crisis for 3 centuries of European seamanship was precisely because patchwork dead reckoning charts could not produce global accuracy. Each local chart carried its own drift. Stack enough of them and you accumulate error, not eliminate it. Something in the source material Piri-Reis was working from carried a level of coordinate accuracy that his civilization had no method to produce. This is worth sitting with as a concrete technical problem rather than a dramatic one. Hapgood students ran the numbers on what it would actually require to build a map accurate enough to place Brazil correctly relative to Cairo without a chronometer. The answer is spherical trigonometry, the mathematics of position on a curved surface, combined with a system for independently verifying longitude from fixed celestial observations taken at widely separated locations simultaneously. That second requirement is the hard one. It implies either a network of coordinated observatories or a single expedition with extraordinary astronomical instrumentation, or a method of longitudinal reckoning we have not recovered. None of those options belong to 1513. The Portuguese, who were the most advanced navigators alive at that moment, were still making longitude errors of 4 and 5 degrees on Atlantic crossings. 4 degrees of longitude at the equator is 440 kilometers. The Piri-Reis map does not carry that error. It carries a different kind of knowledge, one that was already old when Piri-Reis found it. 18 years after the Piri-Reis map was drawn, a French mathematician named Orontius Phineas published a world map that reframes the entire problem. With the Piri-Reis document shows only a fragment at the southern edge of the parchment, the Phineas map of 1531 shows a complete southern continent, surrounded by ocean, labeled Terra Australis. And Phineas wrote something on it that has been largely overlooked, recently discovered but not yet fully explored. Not theoretical, not hypothetical, recently discovered. The academic position is that Phineas was illustrating the classical Terra Australis concept inherited from Greek cosmology, the idea that a great southern landmass must exist to balance the northern hemisphere. He was filling in a theoretical blank. That explanation covers the existence of the continent on the map. It does not cover the rivers. The Phineas map does not show a blank theoretical mass. It shows mountain chains and river systems drawn in specific internal positions. Lay the modern radar imaging of subglacial Antarctica next to it, the Gembersev mountain system, the buried river channels flowing into deep fjords beneath the Ross ice shelf, and the correspondence is not symbolic. The mountain chains run along the same axes. The river estuaries are positioned where the deepest subglacial channels now sit, invisible beneath kilometers of ice. This is the part where I want to stay precise, because the inflated version of this story actually obscures what is genuinely strange about it. The Phineas continent is 2.3 times larger than real Antarctica. It occupies a full third of the southern hemisphere, bleeding up nearly to the Tropic of Capricorn. That is not ancient precision. That is enormous distortion. Phineas also placed China on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico in the same map, which does not suggest access to a perfectly accurate global source. What it suggests is something more unsettling, that Phineas was working with a partial, real source and stretching it. The internal geography, the rivers, the ridge lines, may carry genuine signal. The overall scale was extrapolated, inflated, guessed. Part real, part invented. The problem is that the part that looks real happens to match the part of Antarctica that is only visible to instruments that did not exist until the late 20th century. If Phineas was copying anything real at all, the problem is no longer his imagination. The problem is the source he was copying from. Philippe Buache is the strangest case of the four and the least dramatic, which is exactly why it deserves attention. Buache was a French royal geographer working in 1739. He never approached Antarctica. He was in Paris reading expedition reports, and he produced a map of the southern continent showing something no survey of that era had recorded. Antarctica divided into two major land masses by a central seaway, not a unified continent, an archipelago. His reasoning was visible on the map itself. He had read accounts of enormous icebergs spotted by explorer Bouvet de Lozier in 1738. He theorized that such ice formations required a vast interior frozen sea fed by major rivers, analogous to Siberian watershed geography. He labeled the central region mer glaciale. He marked it conjecturé. He was being a scientist making a transparent hypothesis. In 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, the first systematic subglacial radar surveys of Antarctica returned their results. The continent is in fact divided by a deep structural trough running between the Weddell Sea and the Ross Sea. Remove the ice sheet, and Antarctica does not present as a continent. It presents as two major land masses separated by a shallow interior basin. Buache's sketch from 1739 had the architecture right. The skeptical reading is straightforward. Gifted theoretical geographers sometimes produce correct hypotheses. Buache was a serious scientist reasoning from available evidence, and he happened to land on a real geological feature. That is possible. What makes it uncomfortable is not the correspondence itself, but its specificity. The Weddell-Ross Trough is not a feature you stumble onto by reasoning from iceberg size. It is a subglacial, structural depression buried under kilometers of ice. The route from large icebergs exist to therefore the continent splits in this exact location requires a chain of reasoning that Buache never made explicit. This does not prove he had access to ancient charts. What it does is add a third data point to a series that was already asking for an explanation. While the Antarctic maps get the attention, a document sitting quietly in Venice since 1559 illuminates something different. Not another anomalous match, but the mechanism by which accurate and inaccurate knowledge traveled through the same cartographic tradition simultaneously. Haji Ahmed was a Tunisian geographer whose world map was printed from 6 pear wood blocks in Venice. Scholars believe the woodcutting was done by Venetian craftsmen, possibly Michele Membra, and that the Turkish text in the margins was translated badly enough to indicate a non-native author. The map was likely a commercial product for Ottoman markets, an exotic curiosity about the New World. On that map, the northern Pacific Ocean is not a strait. Between Siberia and Alaska, there is land, a wide, defined bridge connecting the two continents across what is now open water. Geologically, that bridge existed. Beringia, the land connection between Asia and North America, was a real landscape during the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, when sea levels sat 125 meters below their current position. It was the corridor through which the first humans reached the Americas. It disappeared beneath rising seas roughly 10,000 years ago. The Bering Strait was not formally charted as open water until the 1700s. The conventional explanation for Ahmed is almost certainly the correct one. Many 16th century mapmakers believed America was simply the eastern extension of Asia. The land bridge could be a theoretical error, not a geographic memory. But pay attention to the shape of the error. Cartographers who believed America was part of Asia typically showed the two land masses merging gradually as a continental extension. The Ahmed version shows a distinct bounded isthmus, a separate geomorphological feature with defined edges. That is specifically what Beringia looked like. The mistake, if it is a mistake, has the wrong anatomy for the mistake it is supposed to be. What this map shows most clearly is how old cartographic knowledge degrades. An accurate observation made 20,000 years ago gets copied, misunderstood, relabeled as theory, embedded in a commercial product for a foreign market, and arrives in Venice as something that looks like an error but carries the outline of a real landscape underneath. The Ahmed map may be the clearest example in this entire group of how genuine geographic memory and accumulated distortion can exist in the same document, indistinguishable from each other, without independent geological verification. Charles Hapgood spent the last 20 years of his life building one argument. All these maps trace back to a single source, a civilization of prehistoric seafarers who surveyed the entire planet before the end of the last ice age. He called them the Sea Kings. He believed their charts were preserved through Minoan and Phoenician maritime culture, passed into the Great Library at Alexandria, transmitted through Arabic scholarship, and eventually reached the hands of a Turkish admiral working in a Constantinople palace in the early 16th century. Albert Einstein read Hapgood's manuscript in 1953. He wrote a foreword. He called the idea electrifying, and said the proposed mechanism, his theory that the entire outer crust of the Earth periodically slides over the interior as a single unit, was not inconsistent with the known principles of mechanics. That endorsement has functioned as a weapon ever since, deployed by both sides. Hapgood's supporters cite it as institutional legitimacy. Critics note that Einstein wrote it before plate tectonics was established as the dominant model of Earth's crust structure, and that Einstein was genuinely generous with forewords to unconventional manuscripts. The crust displacement mechanism has real physical problems. The crust lacks sufficient lubrication to slide over the mantle as a single, rigid sheet. The centrifugal forces Hapgood proposed as the driver are real but approximately 300 times too small for the displacement required. Modern structural geology does not accommodate it. Stripping out the crust displacement theory does not make the maps go away. You can reject every speculative layer Hapgood added, the lost civilization, the catastrophic freeze, the single global survey event, and still be left with the seismic data and the letter of July 6, 1960. Those two documents are independent of each other. They converge on the same conclusion, without requiring any of Hapgood's additional architecture. The letter exists without the theory. That is the part that stays on the table when everything else is cleared away. Most versions of this story reach this point and cheat. They acknowledge the geological objection and then quietly step around it. That is not what we are doing. Mainstream paleoclimatology is not ambiguous on the central claim. Antarctica has had a continuous, large-scale ice sheet since approximately 34 to 38 million years ago, at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. Ice cores from the Ellen Hills site contain ice that is 6 million years old. The continent's frozen state predates our species by a margin that erases the possibility of a civilization mapping an ice-free interior. This breaks the strongest version of the Hapgood theory cleanly. If Antarctica was green and mapped 12,000 years ago, the geological record should show it at scale. It does not. That is where most channels stop. What they do not mention is what the geological record actually does show, because it makes the question more complicated rather than less. The ice sheet is not a static object. During the Pleistocene and Holocene, the margins of the Antarctic ice retreated and advanced repeatedly. Sediment cores from the Ross Sea floor contain river silt, fine-grained material that forms only through flowing liquid water, dated to between 6,000 and 12,000 years ago. That is not ancient geological time. That is within the window of the Neolithic. NASA and the British Antarctic Survey have documented fossil Nothofagus, southern beach, in the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, 400 kilometers from the South Pole. The most recent samples date to 2 to 3 million years, not 12,000. But the presence of the trees confirms that the continent has been warmer and more accessible than its current state suggests. None of this proves that any coastline was clear enough for ancient sailors to survey in the Holocene. There is no peer-reviewed study making that claim. What it dismantles is the simpler counterargument that Antarctica has been identical to its current state for millions of years, and therefore the entire discussion is absurd on its face. The margins moved, the conditions changed. The question of whether specific coastal sections were accessible during brief, warm windows is genuinely open, not already settled. When the skeptic says, Antarctica has been frozen for 34 million years, that statement is technically accurate and strategically incomplete. The honest version of that argument and the honest version of the anomaly can coexist. They have not been resolved against each other. The thread running through every one of these maps leads back to the same question. Where does Piri Reis actually say his source material came from? He wrote it down. He said he used sources he called Jafariya. Scholars identify that term as a garbled form of Geographia, the Arabic name for Ptolemy's geography. In the same margin notes, Piri Reis references charts from the era of Alexander the Great. He is telling his reader plainly that part of what he compiled came from the ancient Greek world, transmitted through Arabic scholarship. Here is what we can document with confidence. Piri Reis had access to older sources. He said so. Arabic geographical scholarship was a documented transmission chain for classical knowledge, that is, established history. Manuscripts and charts did migrate from Alexandria to Constantinople over centuries through multiple channels, that is, established history. The Ottoman catalogue of Constantinople's library after the fall in 1453 was systematic, not destructive. Here is what we cannot document. We cannot trace a specific map of Antarctic coastline through any of those links. The chain from Arabic scholars preserved Ptolemaic geographical knowledge to a pre-glacial survey of Antarctica survived in that archive has a gap in it that no archival discovery has yet filled. What Piri Reis gives us is not a continuous chain of custody. He gives us something harder to dismiss, a paper trail pointing backward toward a period of geographical knowledge whose upper boundary we do not know, produced by methods whose sophistication we are still trying to calculate. The question is not whether the Alexandria to Constantinople chain is proven. It is whether the alternative, that Piri Reis assembled a map with remarkable subglacial accuracy through random luck with portolan charts, is more supportable than a chain that is partially documented but not fully closed. One answer requires the chain. The other requires the luck. At this point in the evidence, the luck is the harder thing to defend. Take each of the four maps separately, and the skeptical counterargument for each one holds. Piri Reis, distorted Patagonia. Phineas, theoretical speculation that happened to be structurally correct. Buash, a gifted geographer reasoning his way to an accurate hypothesis. Ahmed, an error that accidentally preserved the morphology of a real landscape. Each of those explanations is individually available. The problem is that invoking all four simultaneously requires accepting a specific type of accident 4 times in a row, across independent documents spanning 2 centuries, produced by cartographers with no known contact with each other, in each case accidentally preserving a geographic feature that was only scientifically confirmed after 1949. One wrong coastline that accidentally matches subglacial bedrock. That is an interesting measurement error. One theoretical continent that accidentally places mountain ranges above the Gimbursev system. That is a lucky sketch. One hypothetical archipelago that accidentally maps the Weddell-Ross structural trough 2 centuries before it was measured. That is a remarkable coincidence. One commercial map that accidentally reproduces the specific geomorphology of a land bridge submerged 10,000 years ago. That is strange. All 4 in the same category of error across the same type of unknown geography. At that point, the coincidence is no longer an explanation. It is a claim that requires as much support as the alternative. This is where I want to be direct. The ancient Sea Kings hypothesis has not been proven. No ruins have been found under Antarctic ice. No artifact has confirmed a pre-Holocene global seafaring culture. The strongest version of that theory remains a speculation, but the evidence does not ask you to accept the strong version. It asks a narrower question. Is there something in the source material available to certain 16th and 18th century cartographers that gave them access to geographic data about Antarctica they could not have gathered themselves? That question has not been answered. The standard dismissal, "old maps are full of errors, some errors resemble real coastlines," accounts for one map. It does not account for the pattern. The BedMap 3 dataset is publicly available. It is the most comprehensive radar survey of Antarctic subglacial topography ever produced, and it shows the shape of the continent underneath the ice in extraordinary detail. The mountain chains, the ancient river channels, the deep fjords where liquid water moved before the freeze. Overlay the Piri Reis fragment on that dataset, adjusting for the projection differences Hapgood identified. The Princess Martha Coast, the specific section Lieutenant Colonel Ohlmeyer was evaluating against the 1949 seismic profile, holds its alignment. Overlay the Phineas map on the Gambursev system. Overlay the Buash diagram on the subglacial Weddell-Ross Trough. The comparisons are available to anyone with access to both datasets and a browser. The data does not ask you to believe anything in advance, it just sits there. What I cannot give you is the final answer. The standard reading is available. Old maps are creative documents, and creative documents sometimes accidentally resemble real geography. That reading costs something. It costs 4 independent coincidences in the same category, each one pointing at a landscape that was literally invisible to science until the second half of the 20th century. The alternative reading costs something too. It requires that geographical information about Antarctica existed in some form before the ice closed the record, and that fragments of that information survived transmission across 2,000 years of copying, translation, and compression without any surviving original to trace it back to. Both explanations have a price. The question is which price you think the evidence actually demands. Because what started this conversation was not a theory. It was a letter from a lieutenant colonel, dated July 6, 1960, addressed to a historian who had asked a straightforward question about an old map. And the answer in that letter, from the official technical intelligence apparatus of the United States Air Force, was that they could not explain it. That answer has not been updated. No subsequent study has closed the gap between the map's southern coastline and the seismic profile. No archival discovery has produced the source Piri Reis was copying from. No official body has issued a revision to Ohlmeyer's conclusion. The file stays open, the ice stays where it is, and the map stays exactly as it was found, in a palace library in Istanbul in 1929 by researchers who had no idea what they were looking at.